Harriet Harman says she ignored the Daily Mail's stories about past links to a now notorious group campaigning on behalf of paedophiles because she thought no one would believe what she calls a smear campaign. Now Labour's deputy leader has changed tack. After giving Newsnight an interview last night, she went before the cameras again this lunchtime, this time to speak to ITN's Tom Bradby.
I'm not going to apologise because I've got nothing to apologise for. I very much regret that this vile organisation, P.I.E, ever existed and that it ever had anything to do with NCCL. But it did not affect my work at NCCL. They'd been pushed to the margins before I actually went to NCCL. And to allege that I was involved in collusion with paedophilia or apologising for paedophilia is quite wrong and is a smear.
Nevertheless, you were working for an organisation which did have this organisation with the extraordinary name Paedophile Information Exchange as an affiliate. That's something people would surely expect you to apologise for. I mean, that's a terrible misjudgment, isn't it, to work for an organisation like that?
Well, there had been a big argument within the National Council for Civil Liberties in 1976 where P.I.E were trying to put forward their views and influence NCCL, and NCCL pushed them out, would not even let them speak at their annual general meeting, and turned against them, and that happened before I went there. So when I went there, they had no influence on my work, which was, wide-ranging work.
I understand that, but when you were working there, this organisation was still affiliated. That is something that a lot of people now want you to apologise for on the grounds that it was a colossal misjudgment to work for an organisation with these links.
Well, it was regrettable that they even existed. It was regrettable that they had anything to do with NCCL ever, but it's not true that it influenced my work at the time I was at NCCL or that I've ever apologised for or colluded with paedophilia, because that is the smear.
Harriet Harman talking to Tom Bradby of ITN in the last hour or so. Well, the dispute is over what, if anything, Miss Harman and others did to tackle P.I.E, the Paedophile Information Exchange, when they were prominent figures in the National Council for Civil Liberties, the NCCL, now known as Liberty, to which the paedophile group had affiliated. Harriet Harman, Labour's deputy leader, was the NCCL's legal officer from 1978 until she became an MP in 1982. And along with Patricia Hewitt, the council's general secretary, also later a cabinet minister, and Jack Dromey, Miss Harman's husband and an MP, on the executive throughout the 1970s, she's been the subject of a series of front-page stories in the Daily Mail. P.I.E was one of a large number of groups which paid to affiliate to the NCCL. It disbanded in the mid-1980s after coming under growing public pressure over its views. Here's what one critic, Charles Oxley, principal of a Bible college in Liverpool, told Peter Marshall on The World at One in 1983.
They practice what they preach. They boast about their activities with small children at the committee meeting. They do not normally commit violent attacks on children. Their modus operandi, if you can give it such a grand title, is that they become friendly with children. They lurk around playgrounds and parks, get to know the children, and eventually, after they've made friends with them, they then do what was in their mind all along.
You're absolutely sure of this? They actually carry out these acts?
I'm absolutely certain, yes. No question about that.
How can you be so sure?
Because I've heard them boast about their activities. One of them boasted about an afternoon he spent with two boys on the River Thames.
But they'd say that all this is part of the fantasy.
That's rubbish. I know them. I've attended committee meetings with them.
And you're confident they're capable of this sort of thing?
Absolutely certain. There's no question about it.
Charles Oxley speaking on this programme in 1983. Well, Clive Lander was a member of the executive of the National Council for Civil Liberties at the same time as Patricia Hewitt was its General Secretary in the 1970s. He's on the line now from the United States. Clive Lander, thanks for joining us. Have attitudes really changed to paedophilia in the time since then? Or do you now look back and think, actually, we were just downright naive about this organisation?
I think it's more true to say that they've changed a bit, or actually the way I'd put it is that it became a source of concern. The gentleman you were playing the interview with was speaking back in the 80s. I was on the NCCL back in the 70s. I can't recall the name of the organisation ever coming up as either an affiliate or as somebody trying to influence the NCCL.
And just to be clear, what years were you on the executive?
Because it's so long ago, I'm not entirely clear, but I think I joined the NCCL executive in the early 70s, and I served on it with the tail end of Martin Loney, who was the previous General Secretary. I was there when Patricia Hewitt was appointed General Secretary, and I came off it sometime in the mid-70s.
Because we're now hearing from Harriet Harman that there's a sort of a kind of conscious effort by NCCL to push away PI, but from what you're saying, you weren't really even aware of its involvement with NCCL. That might surprise people a bit.
Well, it shouldn't, because like many voluntary organisations back in those days, and I suspect more true today than it even was then, we spent a lot of time on the agenda worrying about where our money was going to be coming from, because we were always running out of money to pay the staff, what the major campaigns were doing, which companies or organisations, it wasn't companies with the NCCL, but which organisations were affiliated. I don't actually recall ever being on the agenda as an agenda item.
That would suggest that perhaps giving the money, you were just grateful to get the money from these organisations, and if they weren't directly involved with NCCL, you weren't taking a lot of interest in what they were saying. But presumably they were using the connection to promote their cause, weren't they?
Correct you. The affiliates weren't the source of the money.
Oh, okay.
But, you know, sympathisers, supporters, those who believed in free speech and civil liberties tended to affiliate to the organisation. So we didn't draw the line about whether the Conservative Party affiliated, if it did, in one of its associations, or if the Labour Party or the Communist Party or the Marxist-Leninist Party. I think the predecessor of Patricia Hewitt was actually a member of the International Socialists, as I recall. But as a good card-carrying Conservative at the time, and still that side of the fence, frankly, the things we were concerned about were the things that united us, the civil liberties and
freedom of speech.
Yeah, and frankly, if I was back there today and knowing what I do now, if an organisation came forward, today's concerns are things about terrorism and such like. If an organisation was actually within the law and practising freedom of speech, I'd let it affiliate to Liberty, whatever its political persuasion.
Clive Lander, thank you very much for that. Christian Walmer, author of Forgotten Children, a book about abuses in children's home, is a journalist. And Christian Walmer, you encountered some of PIE's members back in the 1970s. Just before we talk about that, just picking up the point that Clive Lander was getting at about freedom of speech, is that why people were apparently so relaxed about an organisation like PIE at the time, do you think?
Well, PIE were actually trying to infiltrate, they're trying to exploit the fact that we were all, you know, working for movements about freedom of speech, about gay rights, about abortion rights, all those sort of things. And they came along and infiltrated organisations like NCCL because they wanted to give themselves legitimacy. And that's what it was about. And they call themselves PIE, by the way. Most of the time, people didn't know what it stood for.
Just on your encounters with them, you were in a building then that they were also using.
Well, I was working for an organisation called Release, which was a Home Office funded organisation that helped drug addicts and with their legal problems and the like. And when I joined, I found out that it was being used as the poste restante by an organisation called PIE. And I said, well, what is PIE? And someone said, well, we're not quite sure, but we think it's the Paedophile Information Exchange. And I was aghast. And indeed, there was some guy in a dirty Mac who'd pick up their mail once a week. And so we discussed it in the collective. It was the 70s. And, they put forward amazing views that they wanted no age of consent. It was perfectly all right for children to have sex and that sort of thing. And we booted them out.
But just on that, you say you were aghast by the views, that they openly explained what they stood for when they were challenged. On that basis, it's quite hard for anyone to say that, well, we didn't really know what they were about. We weren't clear about what they were promoting. Why? What about the attitude then amongst an organisation and organisations, particularly on the left, was it that made them tolerate a group that now to most people seems abhorrent?
Well, I think it was ignorance. And, until I came along, I think there are other people who worked for Release were a bit vague about what this organisation stood for, and they certainly were appalled by the views. And once we actually invited this guy, in a dirty Mac as it happens, to come and say what P.I.E stood for, we booted them out straight away. But I think it shows just the way they were trying to infiltrate organisations and trying to give themselves legitimacy. We worked at a building called 1 Elgin Avenue, West Night. It was a great address for P.I.E to present themselves at, and in the same way, I think that, NCCL gave them a cachet, even though NCCL had nothing to do with it.
Let me ask you finally, do you think there is a need for more clarity now from Harriet Harman, Jack Dromey, Patricia Hewitt, who hasn't said anything yet on this, about their attitudes then and why P.I.E was tolerated?
No, I mean, I think they're taking the right attitude. I think the Daily Mail is just raising an issue that really is dead and gone 40 years ago. It really isn't relevant today.
Christian Warmer, thank you. Let's raise that then with Andrew Pearce, columnist and consultant editor for the Daily Mail. And this is actually quite an old story, isn't it? It was in the Telegraph, I think, 3 years ago.
I'll tell you why we raised this story, and it's a legitimate...
And why now?
Yeah, and why now? And it's a legitimate journalistic investigation for any newspaper outlet, BBC or the Daily Mail. It's because the police returned to the activities of the paedophile information exchange after the revelation of the activities of Jimmy Savile, the paedophile activities of Jimmy Savile. One of the politicians who made the loudest noise about that and demanded openness and transparency from the BBC and accused the BBC of not doing so was one Harriet Harman, the Shadow Culture Secretary. In her role as Shadow Culture Secretary, she has not applied that same high quality of standard to her own work at the National Council of Civil Liberties. Let me just say why we thought it was legitimate to raise these questions. It is not a smear to constantly ask the same question. It is the job of newspapers to ask difficult and sometimes controversial questions. Harriet Harman is the deputy leader of the Labour Party. She will be deputy prime minister if Labour win the general election. She was on a body that affiliated with an organisation that is frankly grotesque and disgusting. And despite what she said today, that organisation remained affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties for many years. In fact, it was only kicked out a year after Harriet stood down from the NCCL.
Are you suggesting that she and the others you've named, Jack Dromey and Patricia Hewitt, then promoted paedophilia?
No, what I'm saying is this.
So what was their offence?
What their offence was not to publicly disassociate from this organisation, not to demand... Why
does that matter so long afterwards?
It matters enormously that they did not do more to get rid of this horrible, disgusting organisation. And see what Shami Chakrabarti had to say about it. She's now the Director of Liberty, which is the successor organisation to the National Council of Civil Liberties. She has apologised for this unregrettable episode in the history of the NCCL, and she talked about it being disgusting and shocking. She's been very emphatic about it. It's a shame that Harriet Harman, who's a very respected politician, can't just admit, you know what, back then, we got it wrong.
Just on that question, what she has said today, and in fact she's tweeted in the course of the morning, a story from Daily Mail Online back in 2011 showing 3 girls said to be 12 years of age posing in bikinis. And she said, when it comes to decency and sexualisation of children, would you take lessons from the Daily Mail? I mean, what she's saying, it's all very well to kind of take the moral high ground on this, but your journalism is not consistent on the treatment of young children and the sexualisation of their images.
The Daily Mail is a family newspaper. No pictures that appear in the Mail or on Mail Online are images that you would not see on any British beach on any day, not regarding the terrible winter we're having at the moment. And to try and conflate those pictures of girls on a bikini on a beach with the grotesque activities of the paedophile information exchange.
She isn't doing that, is she?
Yes,
she's just saying you have to get your own house.
I think she is. I think she's deliberately conflating the two issues, and they do not bear scrutiny at all. The fact is, Harriet Harman, her husband, and Patricia Hewitt, who was another cabinet minister, were senior members of an organisation that was happy to take money and to be affiliated with a grotesque paedophile organisation that at times...
It wasn't affiliated to P.I.E, was it? P.I.E was affiliated to
P.I.E was affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties, which was at times calling for an age of consent for children
Is this going to be on your front page tomorrow?
I've no idea. I'm not the editor of the Daily Mail. But we are delighted that Harriet has finally expressed some regret. We wish she could just go a little further and say she's sorry.
Andrew Pearce of the Daily Mail, thanks very much.